According to UNICEF, 1 in 7 children living under stay-at-home policies for the year 2020 are currently suffering from anxiety, depression, and isolation. In the midst of their education, of building relationships and developing their sense of self, children have overwhelmingly been affected by the pandemic, facing issues ranging from the inability to ensure access to quality education, to staggering levels of loneliness, to the creation of a digital divide. Nonetheless, during the darkest days of the pandemic, acts of kindness stood out. Children built a greater sense of community and re-evaluated their priorities to come out of the pandemic more resilient than ever. The influence of the pandemic on our youth generation gives rise to the question, how can we help this generation cope with the aftermath of the pandemic and reach their full potential? A very warm good morning to esteemed panelists, audience members, and those joining us online. I thank you all for being here today. My name is Jahnavi Babbar. I'm a Year 12 student at the International School of Geneva, and I'm pleased to be the moderator for this session. Before introducing our panel, I'd like to take a moment to remind the audience that the panel discussion will be followed by a 30-minute Q&A session towards the end of this open forum session, and to make sure to use hashtag WEF22 and hashtag OpenForum whenever posting on social media platforms about this event. I would now like to present the speakers. We have an exceptionally accomplished and diverse panel here with us today. To my left, Ms. Fatima Zahra, who is a psychologist, poet, and advisor, rethinking the narratives that shape local and global mental health ecosystems. She's currently serving as an advisor to the WEF's Global Shapers community, as well as to the Oregon Global, the world's leading research organization in the youth mental health field. To her left, we have Mr. Shoriva Sean Benjamin, who is the founder and leading developer of an ed tech application called Learnable. He is an entrepreneur, self-taught, full-stack software engineer who is passionate about technology, innovation, and impacting Africa's future through technology. To his left, we have Mr. Benedikt Schmidt, who is a 21-year-old Swiss politician who is a part of the Young Center Party. He is currently working on an initiative for mental health for younger kids, which will be coming out in August of this year. To his left, we have Mr. Seth Moulton, who is a Democrat representing Massachusetts' 6th Congressional District and a Marine Corps veteran who served 4 tours in Iraq. Congressman Moulton has made mental health his priority, helping to establish a national 3-digit mental health crisis hotline in the US. And to his left, finally, we have Professor Larson, who is a professor of anthropology, risk and decision science, and is the founding director of the Vaccine Confidence Project. In the past, she had headed the global immunization communication at UNICEF. Please join me in welcoming our panelists for today. Now, I think the first very question that I would like to ask all our speakers, starting from my left on to Professor Larson, would be, what do you think are the potential impacts the pandemic will have on the young generations now and as well as in the future?
Good morning, everybody. Can you hear me well? Wonderful. I think what I'm seeing right now as an imminent impact of the pandemic is the resultant collective trauma and grief that we're all experiencing as a result of all the pandemic measures that we've all lived through that have have kind of like disrupted the course of our everyday lives as we knew it. And so this notion of normalcy, we're not really sure what it means anymore, whether it's about our immediate relationships with our immediate environment or educational settings or workplace or even career aspirations or just our own dreams of who we want to be and what we want to do in the future. There's so much uncertainty. At the same time, there were a lot of death. There were a lot of losing loved ones, and this is unfolding into a global mental health crisis that we're not really sure the extent of it, how much would it affect people, what would be the repercussions of it, and so that's something that we really need to take into consideration as we move forward, talking about what are things that we could do to prevent all the impact that is resulting from this pandemic on all these different kind of areas of life. So mental health needs to be at the forefront of the conversation for sure.
Good morning. Sorry. Good morning, everybody. First, I'd like to say it's quite an honor to be part of a very diverse group of speakers. And I think COVID-19 over the past 2 years has affected our lives in so many different ways. And having a very diverse group of speakers will also help us, just contextualize what has been going on in each sector. And one major way that I feel like COVID-19 has disrupted lives is in education, right? If you can imagine that just a year and a half ago, it was illegal to go to school. You couldn't, wake up and go to school the same way that you would before COVID-19. And I think having gone over 2 years of the same repetitive process, people had to adapt to new ways of learning, right? So the old way of learning, even though it's still there, there's now a new blended way of learning that we need to introduce people into, as well as not forget people that are also underprivileged. So what we're trying to do at our startup called It's Learnable is to bring underprivileged and rural teachers into the fourth industrial revolution so that they're not left behind. You find that a lot of solutions that are out there right now are trying to sort of take the part of the teacher by replacing them with automation and things like that. But it doesn't always work in that way, especially for junior school and high school students. And I feel like there needs to be a way going forward to include everyone, even including people that don't have access to devices, right? To be included into the learning journey, into the new way of learning. And I think that's a very, very big way that COVID-19 is going to affect all of our lives going forward.
Auch von meiner Seite, es ist sehr, sehr.
I also would like to welcome all of you. I'm very happy to be here today and to talk about this very important topic with such a diverse number of speakers. When I look at my own experience and my environment, I think we can say that this crisis was very unexpected. And my generation, my surroundings, was completely unprepared for a crisis of this size, of this impact. I think that we already had a number of issues to deal with before this pandemic arrived. But now, the pandemic has sped up these processes. A lot of problems have become more visible in many different areas. Not just talking about education, but also talking about the economy, our society. And I think that we now see also long-term impact when we look at safety politics, for example, on an international level. I think that we need to be able to adapt, to react to these crises, and become more resilient if we want to future-proof ourselves, because there will be more crises in the future, for example, climate change. That would be my statement to this regard.
Well, thank you all very much for being here, and welcome to the students who just arrived. I'm a congressman from the United States, and in the United States Congress, almost everything I do, I'm the youngest guy in the room, and it's really nice to be with people who are younger than me that I can learn from here at Davos. Look, I think about this just breaking it down into immediate term effects, medium term, and long-term effects. In the immediate term, we've seen that mental health cases have gone up by double digits, somewhere in the US between 17 and 25% among school-age youth. About a third of students report being more depressed because of the pandemic. And we also see this reflected in just basic academic success. Double-digit drops in math and reading skills due to schools being closed and remote learning. And all of those things are exacerbated by the divide. They're much worse for lower income students, students of color, than they are for wealthy students, at least in America. In the medium term, we have to figure out how to manage this, because guess what? COVID's not going away. It's going to be with us. It's something that we're going to have to live with. And there are likely to be other pandemics in the future. In America, we've gone from one extreme of shutting down all the schools to another, where some states have opened them up without much surveillance. And the reality is that the right place is somewhere in between. In the long term, there are going to be effects from this pandemic felt for a generation. And that means that 30 years from now, prison populations will probably be a little bit higher because math and reading scores are so much lower today. And so how do we mitigate that? How do we help this generation that's been so affected by the pandemic? And what exactly will both the benefits and the consequences of that be in the long run is hard to tell. My generation was very affected by September 11th. In some ways, all of us have some part of our life that changed because of the attacks of 9/11. Your generation, speaking to all the students in the crowd, will be affected by the pandemic. And what will you make of that? That's still to be determined.
Oops. Is that better? Yeah. Well, I echo all of the panelists and the different perspectives on it. And I think we have a number of different things. I mean, when we were asking Jahnavi which age period we were thinking about, she was saying 5 to 15. When you think about what 2 years is when you're 6, it's a third of your life. 12, it's even. And I, professor at the university, I have a lot of different researchers, and some of them are younger, and some of them were coping in the beginning, and it was beautiful weather, so you had to stay home, but it was okay the first couple months, and then it wasn't okay. So there's a difference between 2 months of disruption and 2 years. It changes lives, it changes people, it changes society. And I think as we heard about this collective trauma, we've got a long road ahead. I think there's 3 things we have to do, particularly from how we do better next time, but how we do better starting now. I think for one thing, I would want to encourage, and we're opening a big, we're calling it the Global Listening Project now, to try to hear from people, because a lot of preparedness plans had system resilience, governance, supply chain, human resources, but somewhere the people weren't in there. And there was like a throwaway line that said, oh, do something with communities. But the reality is that was this huge black hole. And I think our policies need to be more humane moving forward. We have to think of the knock-on effect of severe lockdowns, of kids who may or may not have been affected or as vulnerable. What were the implications of separating people from their dying relatives? Why did we really need Zoom funerals? I mean, there were a lot of different things that I think we should really reflect on, not in terms of the immediate emergency, but to have more perspective of, well, what are the longer term implications when we are making policies? I totally respect the fact that a lot of politicians and decision makers had very little information to act on, but what I hear in a lot of our listening and research is the message was, science said, therefore you do. which is why we had an unprecedented amount of physical and verbal abuse towards scientists. I have a number of colleagues, and I myself have had death threats because our research was influencing policy, and they didn't like the policies. So how can we mitigate some of the levels of anger that were going on? And among my younger researchers and students, they feel like part of their life was robbed, and they're quite angry, some of them. And there's some recent research in France, for instance, that was about, we've done a lot on vaccines because there's a lot of emotions around vaccines, and it's an interesting window. And they said, how did you feel after you got vaccinated? This wasn't, would you take a vaccine, but how did you feel after? Were you relieved? I was personally very relieved. Did you regret it? Or did you resent it? Were you angry? It was really shocking to me. I mean, I know there's a lot of emotion, but what percent were actually angry? They took it because they had to. They wanted to go to the cafe. They wanted to go to that football game, and they couldn't go if they didn't get this vaccine. So there was a lot around that, and how can we do that together with society more? And just on the last point, because I know we want to get another round, I would say three things. One, we have the immediate issue of really paying attention to and understanding for, and I think, you know, the 5 to 8, you know, the under 6, I would say, is a different issue than over. With each age, it's a bit different, but really understand what the immediate issues are, because how we manage this COVID recovery will be absolutely important for preparedness moving forward. I mean, we heard about climate change. If we don't have resilience and trust has come out as a big issue that we didn't do so well on. We have an opportunity for trust building in COVID recovery. If we really, as politicians, as teachers, as employers, pay extra attention, I would say handle with care our employees, our students, our whatever, our voters, to understand what matters to them and what their felt needs are, because people have had a lot of their needs, normal health and educational needs, neglected. And I fully agree with the importance of the digital, addressing the digital divide, because actually right now the digital environment has been divisive rather than bringing cohesion together. And just a last factoid is this year's risk report from the World Economic Forum called out that there was a near 30% drop in social cohesion since the start of the pandemic. 27.8%, almost 30%. That's a lot. They said it was the biggest change in an increased risk. So cohesion's a problem, and for children, for upbringing, for education, I think if we can get that better, we're already on a better path. Thanks.
Thank you so much for your views, all of you. I think I could only agree with all of the views that were said. I think one important thing that was mentioned by a few speakers was uncertainty. There's a high level of uncertainty. We're looking at pandemics, the likeliness of us having another pandemic, it's very likely. And there's a strong sense of uncertainty there. But focusing on that, I think looking at pandemic preparedness, how prepared were we for this pandemic? That we had to transition to tech, complete education. There was a lockdown. We had to transition completely onto technology. So possibly if Mr. Benjamin, Shuri Vashon Benjamin, if you could elaborate on that, since you're in that field, you're looking towards tech, and especially given that there was a pandemic, that impact of it, how prepared we were, and how technology played a role.
I think in terms of preparedness, the whole world was not prepared. There was absolutely no one that was prepared for the pandemic in the way that it actually hit everybody. I think if you were prepared for the pandemic, you were either really rich or, you know, in a lot of trouble if you were fully prepared for it, because a lot of the things that happened, they just came out of nowhere, right? So you find that a lot of people had to quickly adapt to what they had to use, what the technologies that were there. A lot of people were doing learning on Zoom, for example, even though that application was not specifically made for learning, but people had to like resort to that. I know a lot of communities in Africa had to switch to WhatsApp to continue their learning journey. Teachers were creating WhatsApp groups where people, like maybe close to 100 or 150 students would join that WhatsApp group, and they kind of like had received learning material in sync at the same time, because trying to teach students individually via WhatsApp as a teacher was very, very tricky, right? Because imagine trying to respond to every single student's request on your phone, right? So what our application tries to solve is that we created a platform that allows teachers to upload material and distribute that material via multiple inclusive channels, right? These channels include like a mobile phone. These channels include WhatsApp. They also include desktop browser as well. So by allowing multiple channels, we're trying to mitigate that risk of people not having a specific device to access the material. So that same preparedness before the pandemic was not around. It was not there, right? And people would ask about how going forward, why not just allow people to go back to the way things were instead of spending so much time and resources in preparing for the next pandemic and things like that. And that's because digital learning is actually better, right? It's actually better than learning from books. The main reason is that when you have information in a book, in a hard copy book, it's very, very expensive to update that information. It's very expensive to distribute it as well, right? So a lot of the curriculums that are out there that are in hard copy books, some of them are actually outdated. Oxford, for example, they add, multiple words every single year, right, to the dictionary. So imagine having to buy a new dictionary every single year because 2 words were added to it, right? So digital learning is actually better. It's easier to collaborate, and it's much more cost effective, right, going forward. And that preparedness before COVID was not existing at all. But I think COVID forced us to use the tools that we actually need going forward.
Thank you so much for that. I think in the beginning you had mentioned that it was only the rich who had access to those kind of resources, which evidently it created a digital divide amongst the younger kids. And I think not having that kind of a base foundation of education is going to have impacts in the future. So possibly if Mr. Moulton, you could elaborate on that. What kind of impacts do you think that not having that strong foundation of education would have on people?
Well, I mean, certainly speaking of America, but I know this is true around the globe, there's of course a digital divide, and not everyone has the same access to the internet. Some people only have access via phone, while others have laptops or extensive web access at their home. A lot of kids in America who were told that you have to go online to school literally couldn't do it at their homes. They had to figure out a way to go to a library or go borrow internet outside of someone else's house in order to be able to go to school. And of course there are huge consequences to that. There was this 2 weeks at the beginning of the pandemic where I remember thinking, this will be a great equalizer because it's going to affect everybody. None of us has, this immunity to COVID. And that just proved totally wrong, because actually the pandemic dramatically exacerbated the divides that already existed, and the digital divide is very much one of them. So in America, we're trying to invest a lot in this. We're spending about $65 billion in expanding broadband access and hopefully using that federal money to leverage more access through the private sector. But we have a long way to go. Even in a wealthy, successful country like America, there are a lot of people a lot of kids especially, who are not online. And I just want to comment briefly on something Sean said. There's no question that being forced to go digital has opened up some new opportunities in education. And yes, you can update a textbook more rapidly, of course, if it's online. It definitely lowers costs. But the data that we have right now does not show that digital learning is overall better than in-person learning. Some combination of the two is probably best. But a lot of kids have suffered, and their math and reading scores and other test scores reflect this, by having to be online and losing the social interaction. I mean, I even see this in my 3-year-old. The level of social interaction that she has been able to have over the past couple years, of course, is very, very different and much less than kids are used to. And that does have a lot of negative effects. So the long-term solution here is finding out the right balance. It's not saying that, oh, we should just go digital because we had to during the pandemic.
Right, I think you rightly mentioned finding the right balance. I think we're focusing on the quality of education's SDG 4. Possibly, Mr. Schmitz, Benedict, would you like to comment on possibly whether you felt that the quality of education was being compromised? Personal experiences maybe, and you being a politician, probably policies, just your views on that.
Ja, also
Yes, of course. During the pandemic, I was a student, and I also did my A-levels in the spring of that year. Because we had a rise in the pandemic in Switzerland, and everybody was really overwhelmed and couldn't cope. And another big problem was that there was a divide. There were some people who really got well through the pandemic, but on the other hand, if you are in a family with the 2 parents in home office and you've got 4 brothers and sisters, of course, there's more potential of conflict in such a family configuration. So, and that was reality in many families. In other families, it was maybe different. Maybe they had a private space at their disposal to do their learning. So, but on the other hand, of course, you have increased flexibility today. Education has become more flexible. But as has already been said, on the other hand, the new way can't replace entirely the old ways. There are so many things that you have to learn visually that you cannot learn on an e-platform. That's why a good mixture, a hybrid learning model is appropriate. So a mixture of e-learning and learning in the classroom. And maybe during this crisis, especially when you were young, because when you are young, you're building up your personality, and you are trying to isolate yourself to do that process. And if everybody is at home in your family, you can't see your friends, schoolmates, then that is a big problem for building up your own personality. Because you don't get the feedback from your peers, from your environment, and that was an extremely big problem, and still is, I must say. And I'm a bit scared when I think of the long-term consequences of this pandemic, but I think we'll discuss that at a later point. So that's my few comments on this subject.
Thank you so much for that. I think you really provided an insight, especially when you were talking about different types of families and how that has a direct impact on the education or the quality of education that they're receiving. But Fatima Zahra, I believe you're currently pursuing your master's. Do you feel like there's a compromise in the level of the quality of education that you're receiving?
So I'll be speaking kind of more from a graduate level perspective, or graduate education. Personally, I did not really experience any sort of compromise in quality, mainly because at a graduate level of education, we're more encouraged to have more conversations, more debates throughout the classes. We're more also encouraged to bring our own material, our own research papers, our own articles, discuss them in class. So that discussion, whether it's happening in class or on Zoom, there wasn't really much difference to it, and we've had some sort of like hybrid classes as well. Some of my classes were fully online, some were hybrid, and definitely that in-person contact is definitely great, right, when you're in a room. But at the same time, what I found pretty unique about using Zoom, especially for group conversations, is the feature of like raising your hand, right? So that actually like helps you kind of in a way ensure like a smoother flow of the conversation. So in terms of the pros and cons of relying on digital technology to pursue education, I think it really also depends on what is the program that you're pursuing. For example, I'm pursuing a master's in global health, and we don't need, it's not an applied science. We don't need to go to the lab. But my little brother is studying mechatronics, and so I've seen how challenging it was for him to try to understand what is happening while the professor is trying to arrange all those little components. What is really trying to happen? And like he's trying to conceptualize that in his head, and it's just really, really difficult. And so we really need to kind of moving forward when it comes to education, really understand based on the context, based on the type of program, based on the types of learning modalities, what is the best approach? Some programs could definitely be transformed fully online because that also opens up the doors for people who can't really afford to travel to another country and be based out of a different country to pursue perhaps a better quality education. But doing it online, that reduces a lot of the cost, so it's definitely cost effective. But on the other hand, again, it's really challenging, especially for applied sciences. And I also want to circle quickly back to that preparedness. I think one thing that we were also not prepared to witness is the systemic inequalities that are shaping our human systems. We're not really ready to face this amplification of what exists, but at the same time, now we can no longer unsee these systemic inequalities, right? So.
I think you brought in a really good point about inequalities and how they're just amplified now. They were already existent, but they're just amplified now. But I think one thing we touched upon earlier was in-person contact, I think you mentioned, and as Mr. Moulton had mentioned, social interactions. And if possibly, Professor Larson, you could elaborate on that. How do you think that physical touch or this social interaction is going to have an impact on the younger generation?
Well, I think it has a huge impact in the sense that the reality is you don't know who else is on Zoom. And so if you're, and I've had this with some of my students that wanted to really have a genuine one-on-one because they were going through some tough times, and researchers feeling very isolated, very lonely, depressed. Some of them I was on 24/7 just because I was worried. And I know some of them were in very long lines to see counselors, and you know, it never happened, to be honest. So I think there are things that you have more evidence of privacy if you're two people in a room and having, you know, a heart-to-heart about how you're feeling about things. They're uncomfortable sometimes with talking about that in a Zoom type thing. And sometimes, honestly, they would want a call, a telephone call, which felt somehow, well, it is in general more private. You never know who's online or you don't know who's online. But still, so there's that element that I think sometimes, and from a work professional point of view, it's the same thing that, you know, you do your work in a group, but sometimes there are issues you need to resolve, and that happens, you know, in the coffee chats, in the hallways, in these other forums, opportunities that, and I think for particularly younger people, these are, I mean, I think you said it so well, Benedict, this is a time of it's not just about education. And one thing that that COVID did is it really separated these functions in people that are not separated. I mean, we want to be whole, particularly for development. There's your education, there's your personality, there's your physical growth. There's so many things going on, and we were trying to deal with them in separate ways, which isn't normal. But I really appreciate, and it was one of the points I was going to make, Benedict, which is about these contextual factors. Because if it's only about you and your education, but it's not. You've got parents working at home, and the work at home policy also was very divisive because, there's a certain number of people that can work at home, and a lot of people, whether you're, work in a lab. I mean, at the university, we were able to keep the labs open because we're a school of public health, but that's because they had special access and lab benches are suitably separated and you're already in full mask and PPE, so that's different. But there's a lot of other functions, hairdressers, a lot of people who couldn't work online. But the other aspect of is we had dramatic increases in domestic abuse, anger, physical abuse, and kids take that in. If they're seeing tensions between their parents, if they're seeing violence, which we saw, domestic violence, that's also and maybe they don't witness that normally going to school, and sometimes it's not a normal event in the household, but COVID has put pressures on in ways. So I think the contextual issues are really important to consider. The other thing we saw that came out, alongside, to be fair to the positive side, there has been tremendous innovation and acceleration of widespread use of technology. I think the COVID response was assumed far too much in terms of the public's access to all the technology that policies were requiring. And we're also having issues with the elderly, too, who Q code. Come on, what is that? It looks like a hieroglyphic. I mean, there's a lot of assumptions that aren't from an intergenerational point of view also. I do think getting more intergenerational communication is going to be important moving forward. But the last point is that it wasn't just the dividing, the safety of the content online. And one of the risks that we saw, and we have our Commission on Digital Safety here at the forum, but I think it's another issue is what people get online, and there's a lot of bad stuff. So it's not just digital divide, it was the divisiveness of the digital forum, the polarization that was created, and I think that's where the cohesion's going to be important. But we do hybrid, I think, is the way moving forward, although I have an increasing number of meetings and talks where they say, not online. If you can't come, you can't come. I think, and that's fine. It does mean, though, you reduce what you're doing, and actually you give yourself time between places. That's which is we didn't have during COVID.
Thank you so much. I'd like to touch upon two things. First, I think over the pandemic, we've seen that screen time, just time on gadgets and tech, has gone up by a lot. So if possibly, Sean, you would like to elaborate on that. What do you think of that, your perspective on that? And we'll move on from that.
Yeah. So before I answer that, just to touch up on what the other panelists spoke about, when we speak of online learning, we don't expect it to be, we hope that it's not going to be, online learning in isolation, right? We want a blended learning kind of situation to become the norm. And we spoke earlier on about the financial cost of actually acquiring these devices and, and also the financial cost saving when it comes to learning online. But there's also another cost saving, which is the, time cost, right? For most people in this room, the amount of time that you save by doing online learning may be minimal, but on the extreme end, if you look at a kid like in Africa, for example, who has to walk for miles and miles for hours during a day just to get to school, most of their day is gone to preparing to go to school, and it's gone to actually walking to school. So half of your learning time is already gone by the time you go back home. So achieving a blended learning situation in that is very, very important. And to answer the question about time spent on devices, I think the blended learning approach can sort of, we can try to mitigate that by allowing students to learn at home as well as learn physically with other kids and interact with them in a physical space, right? And it's also very important to try to limit the amount of time that people are spending using their devices on social media, for example, you know, and these are also things that are linked to mental health issues that are cropping up now. And there were also, you know, the pandemic actually added a lot to that. And I think having your device as not only just a social media device, but also as a learning device can actually help you divide those two things into a more healthy situation, in my view. Yeah.
Thank you so much. I think one thing you touched upon was social media and its impact. Possibly if Benedict, you'd like to elaborate on that. Do you think the impact of what do you think the impact of social media on these young kids, these, you know, at a very young age now they're starting to have most of their lives on social media. Do you think it has like an impact on them? And you being 21, a part of this youth generation, what would you?
Ja,
Yes, I think that in general, this topic is huge. Whenever we see changes in our societies in the way that we use technologies, there's also always a number of issues that come up, and social media is a very good example for this. I think it is highly problematic that so many parents simply neglect their role as a parent. They simply hand off their kids to the babysitter, well, the babysitter being a tablet or an iPhone. And I don't think that that is a healthy approach. You simply cannot hand over a smartphone to a child that is maybe 6 years old. It is not healthy to have a social media account at such a young age. If you start using the internet and being on social media this early, that means that the algorithms kick in much earlier. It means that companies are able to profile you at a very young age, and they will continue to try and convince you to spend as much time as possible online. They will tailor ads to your profile, and I think that really leads to the creation of this digital bubble. Children will then spend their lives inside of this bubble without ever realizing that they're imprisoned by all of these, by this digital surrounding. They won't be able to acquire the skills to make a difference between different types of media. They're unable to see how these social media networks can influence them. I think that this issue is very pressing because social media is omnipresent. We've seen that in Switzerland, for example, when we look at fake news around the pandemic. I think we need to be very careful that people who find themselves in these media bubbles, these digital bubbles, that they can break free and they can be integrated into the real physical society again. If we don't talk about this topic, if there's not an exchange of different ideas and different opinions, then the conversation is already dead. And I don't think we can function as a society in this environment. It is important that we talk to one another, and we need to foster this dialogue. Media competency is here. It's a key word.
Thank you so much for that. I think you mentioned really important points. That's a pressing issue, especially with fake news and all. I think it's playing a relevant role now. Just so we have 30 minutes for questions from the audience, I'd like to open it to the audience to ask questions. Please make sure to say your name and make your question brief, please. And you can raise your hands, the mics will be coming around.
Thank you very much. I'm Vasil. I'm also a student, just like Jahnavi, at the International School of Geneva. And my question is about, so Congressman, as you mentioned, the pandemic has exacerbated the academic success of students throughout the world. And as has been discussed today, This is partly because of the less effective education systems through, for example, Zoom, and this is something that Mr. Benjamin, you're actively working in improving. And the other reason is the worsening of mental health from the lack of social interactions. And which brings me to my question of, should a mental health education be implemented in curriculums in school, and how would that look like if you think it should be?
I think it's a great question. If Mr. Moulton, you could start us off.
Sure. It's a fantastic question. I mean, just to emphasize this again for everybody in the audience, for every person here, if you look to your left, you look to your right, one of the three of you is more depressed because of the pandemic, according to at least the studies that we have in America. So this has shocking implications. And when I think about how we address the mental health crisis in the world, there are really two fundamental things we have to do. We have to increase access to mental health care, which of course is really what your question is getting at. You know, how do we access care? How do we make sure that the resources are available for everybody who needs them? But the second piece is really important too, which is increasing the willingness to access care. Because a lot of people who have mental health care issues are not willing to admit it, maybe even to themselves, but certainly to others, to get that help. You know, if I told you that I was going to my annual physical after this, you wouldn't say, "Oh my God, Seth, what's wrong with you?" Right? But if I told you I have a mental health appointment after this, that might be, you might not say that, but that might be your reaction. Because the world in which we live does not treat healthcare for this the same way as it treats healthcare for everything else. And that's something that we fundamentally have to change. So when I think about policy in America that we're trying to implement, we're doing things like establishing a nationwide 3-digit mental health hotline. So in America, if you wake up and your house is burning down, you just dial 911. You don't need to find the number for the local fire department. Now, if you wake up and you or a loved one is having a mental health crisis, you just dial 988, and that's a bill that I authored with a fellow veteran. But what got me into mental health from a policy perspective was finally admitting and sharing with the world my own struggle with mental health after I got back from the war. Because I served in the war and I had post-traumatic stress. But it took me a while to even admit to myself that I had an issue, let alone be willing to go and find a therapist. And then when I first got elected to Congress, that was like my biggest secret. It was the one, we call it a skeleton in the closet, that I didn't want anyone to find out about because it might literally end my political career. So what I'm talking about from a policy perspective is also very much from my own personal experience. And I'm also, I think, a good example of someone who's dealt with mental health and now is good. I mean, I still see a therapist regularly because I think it helps keep me mentally strong. But I was able to successfully deal with post-traumatic stress. And that's a message that we have to get out to everybody as well. It's okay for the third of you who are feeling depressed, literally sitting here right now. It's okay to seek help. And you really can get better. From a policy perspective, we need to make sure that everyone knows that and we have the resources available.
Thank you so much for your answer. I think you really elaborated on all the points that we've listed before, but also you talked about willingness, which I thought was very important. Do we have any other questions? Possibly there.
Thank you all for being here. My name is Andrew Fisher. I work at BlackRock. I also went to school in Cambridge, so well aware of the great work that Congressman Moulton has done. It seems like there's a relative consensus around the structural shift in the educational environment, at least in the near term, persisting. And so I'm curious what the panelists think in terms of what can be done and what the future of the educational landscape looks like to create a more immersive environment so as to mitigate some of the negative mental health impacts that have been discussed. Is it Zoom and video calls? Is it a static digital learning environment? Is it augmented reality, which I believe is a component of It's Learnable? And so yes, that's essentially my question. And, what can we do, what can be done in order to create a more immersive educational landscape?
I think that's a great question, if anyone would like to take it on. Go ahead.
Okay, I think what I would say to that is, I think all of them. We need to include all of them. Based on what we've seen in our business is that people learn differently, right? There's no one-size-fits-all solution for education. So by including multiple channels of not only creating and distributing content, but also multiple channels for people to download it and access it, you can actually, narrow down the amount of work that needs to be done to make it a perfect blended learning experience. And we should also emphasize that we hope that the future of education is blended learning, a mixture of all the above, depending on the context. So, and also another additional thing that I feel like we can also do to make it much easier, there's a difference between digitalization and digitizing material. A lot of learning material that we've seen that's online right now has been digitized. Digitized is basically sort of like, photocopying a book and putting it on the internet, or making a 1 hour long video, which is something that we've seen teachers do as of late, a 1 hour long single video about a certain subject. They're basically doing exactly what they would do in a classroom, and the only difference is that they've taken a camera and have recorded themselves. So to make things much more easier to consume digitally for learners, it might be good to have a a pool of material, right, that's in bite-sized forms and very, very easy to digest online. And by making that pool easily accessible to everyone, maybe even for free, right, we can actually, have a harmonized approach towards tackling this problem.
I just want to just make one quick comment to add on to what Sean said, because I think it's so important that, one of the opportunities that the pandemic has given us is an opportunity to really rethink learning. And part of it is recognizing that there are some things that are better done digitally and better done online, and we can have more of a hybrid learning model. But it should also prompt larger questions, like, why do we have summer vacation? Now, this is a very unpopular thing to say because we all love summer vacation, but the reality of summer vacation was just so you could go work in the fields. It's an agrarian society thing, and there are huge consequences to summer vacation, especially among disadvantaged youth who don't have the cool internships and the museum opportunities and everything else. And so we see huge drops in their learning, huge learning gaps, because they take 2.5 months off. I'm not smart enough to know what the right answer is, but we really should fundamentally reevaluate how we're teaching in today's world, because as Sean said, like, there's so much that we do just because it's the way we've always done it.
Thank you so much for that. Did you want to add something?
Ja, allgemein würde ich sagen, dass
In general, I would say that it's very important that we learn to adapt to new situations, to crises, and also on a personal level. That means if we have to face a problem, if we deal with mental health issues, we need to know who we can ask for help. And I think schools are a very important environment for this. There's a recent study in Switzerland that was conducted by an organization focusing on mental health, especially for young people. And this study said that 50% of young people in Switzerland don't even know where they can relax, where they can go to switch off, or where they can go to ask for help. So it is very important that this information is broadly available, that students know who they can talk to in the classroom, and that they then have all these possibilities at their disposal. We've seen that that was not always the case in the past, that many institutions were not sufficiently prepared to help young people and students through this crisis. So I think it is very important that we talk to young people, that we listen to what they have to say, since young people have a very different perspective on these types of issues. And I think that would be the way to go forward. I think that sometimes young people are not taken seriously, or not as seriously as grown-ups, as teachers. So I think it's more important to listen to those people who actually have to deal with these issues in schools. And I mean, at the end of the day, those are the students. The students today don't have a loud voice on a political level. They are not allowed to vote yet. That's also one of the reasons why their interests have been neglected on a political level. This is why I would like to ensure that young people are implicated in all of these conversations, that they have a voice, that we listen to that voice. The young generation will be the one who have to deal with the aftermath of this pandemic. So it is unfair that the older generation are allowed to make all of these decisions that will affect us, whereas we don't have a voice. This is why I would like to call on all of you to stand up for yourselves, to take part, because it's your future that's at stake.
Jahnavi, I just want to echo what Benedict is saying, and I would say this is more important than ever, because particularly after these last 2 years, because if we're talking about how we can prepare for the future, if we neglect listening to what a lot of these, all children and adults too, but particularly children are going through, that they're not articulating because they don't find the space or the person or the opportunity, it's going to have lifelong implications. And it's absolutely crucial right now that teachers, families, if you're in religious communities, whatever, are paying extra attention to making known and available opportunities for people to talk about and for kids, because I think there's less stigma for younger children on mental health because they're not aware of the stigma, but they don't have the language to articulate what they'll say. They're not feeling well. They'll say they hurt, their stomach hurts or their head hurts, but there's a lot of, as they call it, somatic, because this is connected to the rest of us, and we underestimate that, interaction. I've actually gotten into that path from our vaccine research, particularly the HPV vaccine with adolescent girls. We see extreme physical reaction with extended mobility problems sometimes that are now characterized by WHO as immunization stress-related reactions, but they have real physical symptoms. And so we have to be paying attention to, and I think teachers need briefings about the ways that children, younger, either in daycare or children in younger schools or wherever, present unusual symptoms that you don't seem, oh, well, the doctor says it's nothing. Well, it's not nothing. That's even more of a flag if the clinician says it's nothing and they're still hurt.
If I can add on top of that, what you both shared really builds the case for the need to include mental health education in the K-12 curricula, and especially in terms of emotional literacy, because we see that a lot of people, they really want to express or voice their mental health concerns, but we're really not equipped with the right vocabulary to be able to describe that type of discomfort that we're feeling, that type of pain that we're feeling. And if we try to draw a parallelism between that and physical health, we almost all around the world, in almost every school, there are some sort of PE classes, physical education or sports classes. And in those classes, we get to know our body. When we move, when we twist an ankle, we know the level of pain that requires professional intervention, and we also know the level of pain that we could just let it rest and then it's going to heal on its own. Similarly, when we study biology, we get to know the nervous system, we get to know the digestive system. So when you get a food poisoning, you know that there's a lot of discomfort in your stomach area. You know, again, the level of pains that you need to seek professional help for. You also know how to describe that pain because you are able to visualize what is happening inside of you because you know your body. But when it comes to mental health, we don't really know that. Now, if I say physical health, usually the words associated with that I hear in response are usually nutrition, good eating habits, or physical workout. And then when I say mental health, it's usually depression, anxiety, eating disorders. So we're only listing what is wrong with mental health. And we're not really also like defining what is mental health or what is exactly depression. And even when we use these words, I am depressed or I feel depressed, do we really understand do we really understand it holistically? Do we really understand what we mean by depressed? Am I sad? Am I feeling helpless? Am I feeling depressed? What are these nuances in this emotional experience? And I think emotional literacy, being part of the K-12 curricula and being taught to kids since a really young age really helps them build that self-confidence in knowing these are my concerns and I'm able to advocate for them and I'm able to explain it. And that capacity to explain something, that's kind of the first step to actually getting your needs listened to and hopefully met in the near future.
May I just say something? Well, these are 2 points that are very important in the framework of this narrative, of this discourse. First of all, and I talk to all of you that listen to us today, if you really have problems, please, please, please talk about it. Not only because you feel bad, but only because it can get worse. It can get, there can be a serious disease that can develop from these early symptoms. And that's why first entry offers are very important, so that we can contact people immediately. We have to deal with these problems at a very early stage. We have to teach these children how to express themselves, but we also have to show them how they can solve their problems. So that is the first point. A second point that I would like to make, if you don't do that, if you don't open up, then you at one point become suicidal. And that is a big problem. I can only talk for Switzerland, but maybe that is the same problem everywhere. But in Switzerland, it is very important to open up these discussions on mental health, on provision of mental health care, also on a political level. It is important because we need more political pressure in order to get more financial means for the different institutions. Today, you have to wait for 6 months before you get a bed in a mental health clinic, for example, for a child or for a young person. So, and within these 6 months, what's happening? You become suicidal. That's very likely. I met somebody who was concerned by this problem, and he said, if you really need help, and you don't get it, then you try to suicide yourself, then you get attention, and then you get the mental care that you need. So, many young people have already done that. People at school, and that is really incredible. That is not possible, and we have to focus on these problems. We have to offer new solutions. That is really fundamental, because mental health problems are not only an issue for the person concerned, but also an issue for the parents, for the best friends, for the community at large. So that is a real burden for everybody. So we have to talk about it. We have to start to open up. If you need help, please open up and try to get that help.
You mentioned mental health isn't an issue for individuals, it's an issue for a community, which really brings out the importance of it even more. And I really enjoyed the comparison you made. I think it's spot on. We said that you're able to identify the physical pain you have, but you can't identify the mental health or the mental health issues you might be having. And I think that has to do a lot with how the community is portraying mental health, why it isn't being put up as an issue in today's world, as being put up as a prevalent issue that needs to be solved. On that note, do we have any other questions?
Yes, hi. I'm Michelle Michel. I actually organized the open forum, and this is so fascinating, this panel, especially also as a parent. So my question to the panel, specifically also to Benjamin and Professor Larson and Seth, as a parent, I mean, I saw a lot of parents freaking out during the pandemic with having to be the homeschool teacher, struggling with that, struggling with their own work, and then also how can parents have tools to help their kids with their mental health issues, because I think since there are so many waiting lines, since it is so difficult to have the access, particularly for lower income or disadvantaged families, how can we also help the parents to help their children? Because I think as parents, we lack the skills, obviously, and the vocabulary sometimes to help. And I think that's maybe some place where we can bridge something there. So maybe Benjamin, in terms of the homeschooling freakouts for the parents, what types of tools are there?
So I'm very happy to say that we have a tool that kind of solves that problem. We have an application called Learnable Kids. It's in the App Store. It's still in beta mode, but that application arose basically from seeing, parents have to deal with the problems that you're mentioning, right? They have to be on Zoom meetings, and then they leave the kid with a tablet. Their child is done with whatever they were doing on the tablet. They barge in and they start talking to their mom, but their mom is still busy, on camera conducting a meeting, right? And I think an application like that, and there's a number of them that are also cropping up, can actually sort of like help, stage your home parenting journey with your child, right? And I feel like parents had it on lock for quite some time, how they sort of like structure their child's play and learning process with them being in the house. But I also think having to do it for 8 to 12 hours a day was a big curveball for most parents. So I think the solution can be around, trying to figure out a way to just time your, or rather your preparedness, right, for the following day, and creating like a proper learning and play structure for your child. And just also, from a young age, training them, say, look, when I'm in a meeting, when I'm doing this, this is where you need to be, and, and et cetera. So, and these are things that we're also all just figuring out as time goes, reiterating and, restructuring our solutions and how we tackle the problem. So, but yeah, that would be my answer to that.
Professor Larson, would you like to add on that?
I think that was a great interaction. But I was thinking about PTA associations. I don't know if they have them, how much in other countries, but I know in the US, these parent-teacher associations, because the teachers and the parents, in fact, I have 2 colleagues who abandoned their normal professions and decided to go into teaching because they saw, they both saw, they said, we realized how important teaching is, and actually, how much, our son or daughter benefited from it, and that they had learned a lot about, not everybody can or wants to do that, actually. Some are just so fed up with it. But it also creates tensions between couples because, who does the parent when they're both working and they both have their meetings. And I know some families have tried to get older children, help out the younger children, but everybody's got their, but I do think figuring out ways to support parents and teachers in these situations. When we think about pandemic preparedness, we really need to look at all these other situational issues and fallout that was not part of the science says, therefore you do this. I feel for the children of China right now. The intensity of the lockdown, even in Spain, they couldn't leave their house. They couldn't go to the park. I can't imagine what some of the implications of this are, but I do think it's going to be important because, you know what, if it's not a pandemic, which it will be, and probably influenza 1, maybe not next week, but it's definitely going to get monkeypox. No, that won't spread, don't worry. It will spread, but not in the same way. But we've got climate change, and we've got, conflict. There's so many shocks, potential shocks to the system that are going to mean that we have a reasonably high likelihood that we're going to have other situations where we're going to have to hunker down at home and manage for periods of time, or do things differently, or travel less because of petrol shortages. And how do we, that might be another thing as we are limited in challenging energy supply. There might be a suggestion that actually work at home as much as you can. school at home occasionally because, you know, or we don't have enough gas to go around. Or so there are other situations, knock-on effects that I think finding ways to support beyond the pandemic is going to be important.
I'll just respond real quickly. You know, first of all, I'm able to be here today because my wife Liz is at home taking care of our kids, even though she has a full-time job as well. So this is a constant balancing act. And going to school is really good for kids. Sometimes it's good for adults too, right? And so that's something that's been a bit of an adjustment. We feel very lucky, though, that our 1-year-old wasn't in school. Our 3-year-old happened to go to a nursery school that stayed open throughout the pandemic. So we didn't have to be stay-at-home principals like our friends who have kids who are just a little bit older often had to do. But there are two issues, I think, that have come up before that I'm really thinking about as a dad. One is this question that Benedict Rose brought up about what is an appropriate age for kids to have iPads, phones, you know, digital access, or be sitting in front of the TV. And there are not a lot of studies that look holistically at the effects here. And some parents say, well, this is a reality of modern life. You gotta introduce it to kids early. Anecdotally, a lot of my friends who are in the tech world say that all the top tech execs do not let their kids use devices at all, which makes you think, what do they know, right? And so like my rule for a 3-year-old and 1-year-old is nothing, you know, and we'll debate, my wife and I, about when we open that up at all in the future, but that's the role right now. And then the second point I wanted to make is on this, again, this question of physical versus mental health care. You know, I got up early today and I went for a 45-minute run because I know that that's good for my physical health. And it's not because I have some physical injury that a run is curing. It's because it's proactively good for my physical health, right? But what have I done today to proactively take care of my mental health? What have I done to make me mentally stronger?
The run might have helped.
The run absolutely helps, and I was going to get to that because yes, these are connected. I know that I have to work out because it's helpful for my mental health, but we don't really think about it that way. We don't think about how do you exercise your mind, how do you practice mindfulness, as some of our elite special forces are doing now in the United States, not just to take care of mental stresses, but because we know that it makes them more effective soldiers. So this has to be a part of the conversation as well. And figuring out how I teach that to my girls is a really interesting challenge. But that's one of the things that I'm thinking about now as a dad. How do I talk about? I mean, sometimes my 3-year-old will come in when I'm working out in the yard, and she knows what dips are now, right? And but how do we talk about mental health care in that same way?
I would add to that, when it comes to mental health, there is no one-size-fits-all solution, but perhaps where we can start is understanding that mental health and well-being is not really a state of being, but it's more of a continuum, more of a balance between stress factors, what we also call risk factors, and protective factors. So whenever you're not feeling well, you look at what are the risk factors that are present in my life at this moment. And you look also at their weight, because one stress factor could weight incredibly a lot, right? And so you look at the amount of risk factors that you have, and then you look at the other side of the balance, the protective factors. What do you have in there? Do you know any potential protective factors? Just shout them out. What's a protective factor that you just engage in or use or employ to protect your mental health when you're going through adversity? Meditation. Breathing, exercise, great. So there's a huge list of protective factors that you could just look up on a random Google search and experiment with them. See what actually helps you balance out that mental health balance so that you could bring it more to an equilibrium, and that way you restore kind of that mental health balance, right? So for example, going back to that parent and kid, so you are like two different entities with your own particular mental health needs and concerns, right? So when you're with your kids, you are aware of your own mental health balance, And you also try to create this space for a conversation where your kids are also start becoming aware of their own mental health balance and how both interact. Because when a lot of times when we're trying to address the concerns of somebody else, that adds to our own stress factors. Although it stems from good intentions, but we can't really deny the impact it has. It takes tremendous amount of emotional energy and social energy to be able to really listen to somebody, to really provide that psychologically safe space for them to explore, to voice their concerns, and help them rework it, help them engage with it, and help them hopefully cope with it and overcome it. And so there are three main protective factors that have been proven to be very helpful. One is social and emotional skills. So that, again, goes back to emotional literacy. Emotional literacy is the very foundation of the social and emotional skills, and it goes all the way up to conflict resolution. And you go through all the kind of 4 key skills of emotional skills, which are emotional identification, understanding what is happening within you, emotional regulation, figuring out how you can balance out the different levels of emotional intensity, emotional expression, being able to put that into words, being able to let people truly understand whatever is happening in here. And then 4th, relationship management or emotional management, which involves the other person. So these are like social and emotional skills. And then we have social support. So social support needs to be this, some sort of community that helps you feel psychologically safe and at the same time challenges you to be able to just look within, voice that, continuously transform your own personal narrative, because if you have that one story that defines your entire life, that's stagnation. You need to continuously be able to transform your narrative, and one way, or like the most effective way to do that, is you voice it out, you allow other people to engage with it, and that makes you rework it again and again and again and again. And then when it comes to social support, you don't just find one community and you're like, that is my one community, because we're all multifaceted. We have so many different, parts of ourselves. You could be for example, for myself, I'm a psychologist and a poet and a photographer and also a daughter and also a Moroccan and also now living in Turkey and so kind of being part of this, like the foreigners, right, in a particular country. And so I always try to find communities where all of these kind of parts of my own identity are being reflected and feel the belonging, and that increases my sense of support, my sense of also safety and protection. So this is about kind of social support. And then the third element is hobbies. So hobbies is whatever you engage in just for the fun of it. You just want to play. Yes, you care about the result. When you play, you want to win the game. When you are painting a certain paint and you want the result to look good. But the outcome doesn't matter as much as the process. And so hobbies, they also allow you to create this psychologically safe space for yourself, by yourself, where you also get to engage in any form of creative self-expression that, again, allows you to continuously transform that narrative. And so whenever you feel bad, just picture that balance in your head: risk factors, protective factors. What do I have? What can I add? Can I get rid of a bit of the stress factors? Maybe I can't. All right, let's just try to increase the balance for the protective factors, and hopefully one would trump the other. I hope that answered.
Also ich finde, ein Punkt, der vorhin erwähnt wurde, ist...
I think something you said was very important. This mental health problems are it's a very complex issue. And in my political party, we talked about how to solve this problem. And our solutions are different. For example, we want mental care for every for every child with mental health problems, because we know the earlier to take these children into care, the easier it is to prevent a serious illness. And prevention is very important. Prevention is a very large field, and that concerns everything: health, education in society in general, everywhere. And we asked ourselves, how can we solve this problem most efficiently? What kind of concept can we develop in order to make prevention as effective as possible? And we think that these solutions, these approaches must be interdisciplinary. We need a narrative between the youth, young people, education, and politics. These disciplines need to work together to have interdisciplinary approaches in order to get all the different communities involved. And I talked about it earlier on. Who is really attractive for young people? Who do they listen to? Who do I take seriously as a young person? Who can I trust with such a difficult problem as mental health? For example, when I break a leg, for example, then I can see something, I can feel something, and you can be empathetic to this person. But if you don't talk about the body, if it's on the psychological level, how can I communicate in this regard? At school or anywhere. It's a fantastic panel today. You mentioned so many important points. Also the vocabulary. How can I express myself to be really understood by others? So all these solutions, all these approaches have to be discussed on an interdisciplinary level. Doctors, therapists, schools, teachers, young person, and politics, everything need to come together. I think that is the only way to improve the situation for the future, for our children. And we are really, as young people, we have to be active. You talked about climate change, and there will be other crises. You mentioned it already. And we have to be ready to face these new challenges, and we need to have faster solutions for these problems.
I think, sorry.
Coming to the end of the session,
Yes,
so
okay.
please we'll try and make it short.
Right. I'll make it very, very quick. And I think to add to the solution of prevention, a very, very big one, a very, very important one is to start them young, right? Like, because at a very, very young age, if device access is the only form of entertainment that your child is receiving, as they get older, you can imagine that will get worse and worse and worse. It's the same as being born with a cigarette and alcohol in your hand, right? As you get older, your dependence on that becomes worse and worse and worse. So I think it's very important to also start them young and to get them to understand about how there are other creative ways of having fun that don't involve, a mobile device.
Thank you so much for that. Since we're coming to the end of the session, if we could just go from Professor Larson to here, Fatima Zara, just one piece of advice for the youth generations to cope with the gripping impact of the pandemic, just to conclude it.
Well, I think we've highlighted, I would just reiterate the importance of listening and finding, using this opportunity to be together again with friends to really share what you've been through, talk about it. It really matters.
Look, I'll just say that we all know that this has been very hard, and the pandemic has affected everybody, but it's affected you more than anyone else. We know that. But this is also your opportunity. It's your opportunity to lead, to show how we can come out of this, and to show how we can handle these challenges better in the future. So I hope you will take the opportunity to lead.
Ja, ich würde mich.
I would like to, I think I'm still part of that generation, so I'm not sure if if I can give an advice to somebody else. I would advise all of us, including myself, that we have to talk about our problems. We have to really spell them out. And if we speak up, then we will be heard. I think politics is very sensitive and paying attention to the problems that the youth are facing today more than ever. So we need to use this momentum. So I would like to call on all of you. Speak up, talk about your problems, you will be heard.
I'd like to say that I think it's very, very important for all of us to have a harmonized approach towards solving and achieving these SDG goals. Because sometimes achieving the goals can look like playing a game of whack-a-mole, right? When you hit one, another one pops up somewhere else. But imagine if there's 5 or 8 of us, just whacking them at the same time. We can, achieve what we're trying to all achieve by working together. And I think it's very, very important.
Yeah,
Definitely. Right here, right now, we're part of an incredibly challenging, yet at the same time wonderful time to literally reimagine all of our systems and to be able to contribute to that global narrative shift. You might be thinking, how can my voice contribute, right? But I'd like you to think of yourself as part of a global choir. If you can add one octave to that choir, there you go. Narrative shift has happened.
Thank you so much. I think it's a beautiful note to end on. I'd like to thank our panelists for their time and input today, and the audience for being so participative. Thank you for joining.